Thank you for inviting me to come to Sweden. When I used to come to Sweden and present statistics on inequality and health and well-being, it always felt rather nice. It was a bit like being in a warm bubble bath, because you do so well, you know, and you're always sort of at the top of the charts, and I'm afraid it might not feel as warm and bubbly today. In The Spirit Level, which is the book that my co-author and also my husband, Richard Wilkinson, and I published in 2009, we used data comparing the rich developed countries and the 50 states of the USA to look at the relationships between income inequality and a whole range of health and social problems. And the book was full of graph after graph after graph showing the same thing. But if you can understand this chart, then you get the whole picture. When income inequality rises, health and social problems rise as well. And that's true for a large number of problems. Health problems including life expectancy being lower, infant mortality being higher, levels of mental illness being much higher in more unequal societies. But also problems related to what the economists call human capital development, so children's educational attainment, social mobility, rates of teenage births, and measures of social cohesion as well. So trust goes down in more unequal societies, levels of violence and levels of imprisonment rise. And it was a controversial book, perhaps unsurprisingly, because its implications are deeply political and people have ideologically based opinions on whether or not they think greater degrees of inequality are a terrible thing or a necessary thing. Some people even think they're a good thing. So there was a lot of debate about our work. Mostly it focused on the graphs we had shown in the book, almost as if no one else had ever published anything on this subject. And so various people would take countries off and make a relationship go away, or add different countries in and make a relationship go away. Not very convincingly, but we have had to spend quite a bit of time over the past few years providing counter-arguments to that and providing new evidence. And we've just published, it's actually about a year ago now, a review in the journal Social Science and Medicine, which looks at the relationship between income inequality and health in an epidemiological causal framework. And so I would encourage any of you who still sort of want to think about the methods and what the body of evidence shows as a whole to go and have a look at that. But we have causal criteria in epidemiology that allow us to look at a whole body of work, you know, studies of various kinds from different places on related topics, and sort of summarize the evidence as a whole and decide whether or not we think this is a causal relationship or not. I think some of the strongest evidence that's come out fairly recently has been looking at that which looks at changes in levels of income inequality in different societies and changes in outcomes, or looks at the lag times between those changes and the changing outcomes. And there are several studies now that didn't exist when we wrote The Spirit Level, which we actually, I think, finished writing in about 2008. And several studies since then have provided some really useful sort of temporal analyses looking at changes. There was a meta-analysis published in the British Medical Journal by Kondo and his colleagues, and they looked at the effect of income inequality on health in cohort studies, where income inequality is measured at the start of a period time, and people are followed through time, and their mortality experience is recorded. And in that meta-analysis, Kondo and his colleagues concluded that income inequality does have a modest impact on mortality. But a modest impact of something that affects a whole population can actually be a very large-sized impact in terms of the number of people affected. And it was millions of people within the OECD countries suffering premature mortality each year because of higher levels of income inequality. And these studies all are controlled for every single individual's education and or income. So they're looking at the effect of income inequality above and beyond whether people themselves are rich or poor, highly educated or poorly educated. There's also been a great study by Zeng, again published in Social Science and Medicine, who carefully looked at the lag times between when income inequality changes and when you start to see an impact on the health of the population. And he shows that this starts to kick in a few years after you see income inequality starting to rise, that it continues to have a cumulative effect through 12 years from a change in income inequality, and then it sort of levels out again. So we're starting to understand how long it takes for population health to suffer from an increase in inequality. And there was a great study, it all seems to be in the journal Social Science and Medicine, but I guess that's where we all publish, a great study from colleagues in America who looked at the experience of people who migrated to the United States in terms of their health. And if they had come to the United States from a more unequal country, their health tended to be better than if they came to the United States from a more equal country, and so had come to the United States and experienced something worse than where they'd come from, rather than coming to the United States and experiencing something better. It's a very interesting study of migrants, and migrant studies have a long history of showing us how important the social determinants of health can be. And we've seen some mediation analyses too, so people asking, is it social cohesion that mediates between income inequality and outcomes like the homicide rate or levels of health, or is it spending on public goods? And it turns out that social cohesion is a better explanation of the pathway than any kind of public spending. But I'll start my next bit with a slide which I hope you'll like, because it's looking at child well-being in more and less equal rich countries using the UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing, which was published in 2007. And that contains 40 different components of children's well-being, everything from whether or not they can talk to their parents or find their peers kind and helpful at school, to whether or not they eat their fruits and vegetables, whether they're vaccinated, educational scores, the lot. We took one measure out because it was the proportion of children in relative poverty, and that's so like income inequality that you would really have a circular argument there. So we took that out, and looking at the 39 remaining components of child well-being, Sweden does best of all, and the UK did worst. And there's a statistically significant correlation between a country's level of income inequality and how well its children are doing on this particular index. This caused a lot of consternation in the UK. We don't like coming bottom. We usually don't come bottom. The US usually comes bottom, but here we were doing worst of all. Our government's response was twofold. One was to say, oh, well, the data are rather old. Things have changed since then. And the other to say, these are only statistics. They tell us nothing about the lives of families. Now, statistics are the best way I know of to tell you about the lives of families in different societies. But in fact, UNICEF UK went and did a qualitative study of families' lives in Sweden, great equality, great child well-being. The UK, lousy inequality, lousy child well-being in Spain. which does quite well in terms of child well-being and is sort of out in the middle of the income distribution, income inequality distribution. And they found that really the statistics came to life. Family life in the UK was impinged upon by inequality in all the ways you might expect. Higher levels of mental illness, higher levels of debt, families not having enough time to spend with their children. And you could see the statistics brought to life in the stories. And when they published that report, the government and others said, these are just stories. Okay? So it's really important to have both. You need your stories and you need your statistics. But the story of how things looked in 2007 hasn't remained the same. In 2013, UNICEF published a new index of child well-being. Slightly aggravatingly for researchers, it didn't contain exactly the same components as the 2007 index, but it did contain enough of them. I think there were more than 20 that were the same in both 2007 and 2013. So we calculated a change score for each country, how well they'd done over time on this index of child well-being, and we've compared that here to changes in income inequality across the approximate decade of 2000 to 2010. I haven't got one of those holders with a little light, so I'm going to have to move. But you could draw a line horizontally from where it says same there across, and countries below it have got worse child well-being in 2013 than they did in 2007. If you are above that same line, then you're doing better. You know, child well-being has improved. Over to the left are countries that have become slightly more equal, and over to the right are countries that have become more unequal. And Sweden has seen a decline in its performance on these indicators of child well-being that is almost exactly predicted by its increase in inequality. And just yesterday, a colleague from Canada sent me this graph, which comes from the Health Behaviour of School Children study funded by the World Health Organization that looks at the health of adolescents in lots of different countries. And he's looking at health symptoms in red and life satisfaction in blue, and looking to see how those scores differ depending on the amount of inequality children were exposed to and when. And basically, if you are exposed to inequality in your early life, you are more likely to experience higher level of problematic health symptoms and a lower level of life satisfaction. I emailed him about it this morning, and he said, just tell people, if you're living in an unequal country, get out before your children are 3. Because that's the point at which the damage starts to accumulate. And I was also quite astounded this summer when I was writing a report for the Cambridge Primary Review Trust in England, which is a charity that looks at primary school education, so education from the ages of 4 through 11. And they asked me to write about inequality in relation to educational inequality, gaps in achievement between rich and poor children. And while I was doing the research for that, I came across this report from the OECD, which I thought was really a very unusual report for the OECD. It basically tells Sweden to change its education system. And I don't know of other reports that it's produced that are sort of anything like the same tone. It suggests that declining educational standards in Sweden, which have been dramatic over the past few years and are not seen in neighbouring countries, are in part a consequence of changes in the educational system. and a move away from a more equitable educational system. I'm not an expert on your educational system. I've read it and it looks convincing to me, but I will have to leave it to all of you to think about how your education system has changed and the impact it might be having on children and young people. The other thing that I think has really changed over the past few years is our understanding of the psychosocial impact of inequality. Your minister spoke earlier about the importance of psychosocial factors in the workplace. You know, the things that can't be measured by the standard health and safety measures or things like that. And the psychosocial impact of inequality is why the whole population gets affected when the income differences increase and the social differences between us increase, the distances between us, the class differentiation, the levels of status competition and the importance of status. We hypothesized in the spirit level that rising levels of status anxiety in unequal societies would be part of the explanation of the link between inequality and health and social problems. But we didn't have any evidence at the time. We were really just speculating. And now we have this study by Irish research group looking at status anxiety in European countries. It's slightly complicated, but the top line are levels of status anxiety in the most unequal countries, and the bottom line are levels of status anxiety in the more equal countries. So you can see that anxiety is higher in the more unequal countries, but it's looking at status anxiety across the income distribution from the poorest groups over to the most affluent group, the poorest tenth up to the richest tenth. And at every level of the income distribution, status anxiety is higher in more unequal societies. So you're not protected from that by being rich within an unequal society. Depression is higher in more unequal societies. These are data from the US states. We had been the first to look at income inequality in relation to mental illness, but there have been a number of new studies confirming those findings, including the fact that schizophrenia is higher in more unequal societies, as well as depression and anxiety. It seems that if you live in a society with more inequality, where status anxiety is raised and status competition more intense, you can react in one of three ways. You can go under, basically. You can withdraw. You can be depressed, anxious. Or you can claw up and sort of try to bluff it out and present yourself as doing okay even when you're not. These are data from Jean Twenge showing a rise in narcissism in United States college and high school samples across the period where income inequality has been rising as well. I would recommend her book, The Narcissism Epidemic, to you. It's full of fascinating statistics and really documents a troubling trend, particularly in our children and young people. So you can go under, you can fight your way up. This is self-enhancement in more and less equal societies. And self-enhancement is saying that you're better than you average, okay? And usually better than you are. So in America, I think it's 96% of drivers say they're better than average, okay? You're a sophisticated audience, so you understand the statistics. Unlike, I think, our education secretary back home who wanted all schools to become above average. In Sweden, it's only about 2/3 of you who say you're better drivers than average. So you're more modest than Americans, although still more of you on average should not be saying that. But in this study, psychologists asked people a whole range of questions. Are you a better driver than average? Are you more intelligent than average? Are you better looking? Are you a nicer person, etc., etc.? And the tendency to self-enhance, to say you're better than other people, increases with levels of inequality, which I think fits with that narcissism picture. And of course, There is a third way of dealing with stress and anxiety and competition, and that is to try and blot it out. We see illegal drug use much higher in more unequal societies, deaths from alcoholic liver disease as well. And what we're seeing in our young people in England is an absolutely appalling epidemic of self-harm. I don't know if you're having the same thing here, but a real tragedy of epidemic proportions. It seems as if for young people, if you grow up in a competitive dog-eat-dog world, you need a whole set of strategies about how you cope with social relations that's different to if you grew up in a more collaborative, reciprocal, trusting society. And too many of our young people are ending up feeling excluded, lonely, depressed, anxious, that their life chances are no good, that they have no hope of social mobility, that much is denied to them, and little support given. I'll finish by saying that almost all countries in the Western world have seen big rises in income inequality over the past few decades. In Sweden, they were later than most places and shallower than some, but still you have seen those rises. Those rises aren't due to some natural phenomenon. They're a result of political choices. They're a result of the grip that neoliberal economics took hold as a model for how we construct our economies, how we do capitalism. And the thing is that the people who put that model together, they didn't know about the links between income inequality and health and social problems. They thought a rising tide would lift all boats, and that actually the economic model that they were proposing was going to lead to increased prosperity for all. They were wrong, but they did it from a position of ignorance. The data were not available then. We are in a different place. We know. We know that their model didn't work, and we know that inequality has a causal effect on health and social problems. We can see it being lived out in the bodies and minds and feelings of our young people every single day. And we get to choose in our democracies about how we want our societies to serve our young people and provide them with equal opportunities that lead to equal outcomes. World leaders are talking about income inequality. I'm going to skip this and hope that I'll be able to leave the slides with you so that you could look at them later. Nobel Prize winners in economics are talking about the damage of inequality. We know now. We have no excuse for carrying on in the same old ways. And inequality reduction is one of the Sustainable Development Goals for the world. I heard that there is a paper showing that Sweden is the most likely to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals first. You know, you're going to get there first and you're going to probably get there further. Don't do it without addressing the goal number 10, to reduce inequalities within your society as well as between them. That's our book in Swedish, and next to it we've also just in Swedish published a very, very short work on the links between inequality and sustainability and the need for more economic democracy. So I think you might even be able to, you can read it in English for free. I don't know if you can in Swedish for free, but I'd encourage you to take a look. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm sorry I've run over, and I'm sorry I couldn't speak to you in Swedish.
Thank you so much, Kate Pickett, for that presentation. And I don't think anyone is sorry that you took a little more time. Instead, I want to ask you some more questions. And you opened up by talking about this bubbly, nice feeling of coming to Sweden. But how do you feel now when looking at the statistics?
Well, I feel they're very sad. In some ways, I think, you know, you are still in a much better place than we are in the UK. Than the populations are in the USA or in the very, very unequal areas of the world, like Latin America, for example. But sadly, I do feel, the statistics show you're going in the wrong direction on inequalities, whereas some areas of the world, including Latin America, are moving in the opposite direction. When I saw the films that UNICEF UK had made about families in Sweden, the UK, and Spain, I found it deeply upsetting as a British mum, because I could see the strain and the anxieties and the pain in the British families, and it was such a contrast to Sweden. I know your minister spoke about the inequality of household tasks and domestic work, but it's a lot better here than in many other places. And you could see a real commitment from both men and women to child development. They seem to instinctively understand good parenting. And I found it very upsetting to sort of see that contrast. Mm-hmm. So I still think, you're in an incredibly good place. And I think maybe we should just all be grateful that we do have modern data gathering systems that allow us to look at changes rapidly and perhaps change course.
Yes, and obviously, how simple is it to change course? Is it enough just to close the income gap? Or, look at Sweden, we still have a huge race of the bottom over the past years, so to speak. And what is the most important thing, to close the gap or raise the bottom?
You could certainly do both. There are all kinds of things you can do to reduce inequality. Some of them are to do with raising the bottom, so arguments about high minimum wage, a living wage, issues to do with gender equality can be very important. But I do think the ratio between pay at the top and pay at the bottom, the scale of the differences, has been driven over the past few years, not really by what's been going on among the poor, but by the runaway incomes and bonuses of those at the top, and the capture not just of wealth but of political power by those at the top. But the research also shows that there are really different ways of achieving greater equality, and it doesn't seem to matter which you pick, just as long as you do it. And you do it very differently in Sweden to, say, how Japan does it. But it doesn't seem to matter. So there's a smorgasbord of policy options. That's my only Swedish joke. It wasn't a very good one.
Well, just one question about the statistics from UNICEF. Was that taking in consideration our welfare system and the distribution of as well?
No, they don't look. They are looking at indicators of children's individual well-being. So they do include things like the percentage of children who receive good early childhood care, but they don't include any level of financial transfers or anything like that.
You were talking about school, and that's one thing that has been coming up during the past 2 days during our talks, that the solution for so many of our problems seems to be the public school system. And on the other hand, that's where we know statistically that we have the problems, although people are questioning the statistics here too. But how important is that compared to closing the income gap?
I think schools are hugely important, but I think we do a real injustice to our teachers and our head teachers and our teaching assistants if we're expecting them to fix the structural problems of society in their classrooms. And by the time children get to school, so much damage can already have been done. We see huge differences at the age of 3 between rich and poor children in their level of development. That's before they would even qualify for most preschool programs. Poor children hear a much poorer vocabulary in the home, not because their parents aren't interested in them or not wanting to parent them well, but because they are in debt or working long hours or mentally unwell, etc. So I think we expect too much of our schools. They can be a huge force for good and for social mobility and for improving children's life chances, but they can't fix society's problems.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions. Thank you all for listening.